Man, today has been a real productive day. It's still not over yet because I'm back. I know it's been a minute since you've seen my handsome face, my 4 subscribers, including myself, but I'm here, you know what I'm saying? And I know my absence may disturb you, and I don't mean for that to happen, sincerely. But you know what else is disturbing? This case that still hunts Siberia that we're about to watch right now. So let's do that. I
This is
believe.
Kazinet. It's just a tiny collection of houses in a single railroad in the middle of the Siberian taiga. On the night of August 14th, 1989, a regularly scheduled train came through this cold, lonely stretch of woods until approaching something up ahead on the tracks. At first, the train conductors couldn't tell what they were looking at, but when they could, the discovery would be one of the most gruesome and horrifying mysteries in modern Russian history. As always, although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. The village of Kazinet in Russia is the kind of place that doesn't show up on most maps. It's tucked deep within the Siberian taiga, surrounded by an endless sprawl of pine and birch trees, and it's actually less of a village and more of a scattering of houses along a lonely stretch of railroad tracks. And with a population of about 24 people, there are no shops, signs, or proper roads, just train tracks, a few homes housing railway workers and their families, and a few dirt roads that seem to lead into the forest to nowhere. And given its location in August, the nights here are deceptively cold. Summer days can turn to sudden frost, and the sun vanishes quickly. By midnight, the
Bro, let
landscape
me eat
is
my
swallowed by
fucking yogurt
cool
in
darkness
peace.
that makes you feel like you're being watched. It was in this silence at precisely 1:40 in the morning on August 14th, 1989, that freight train number 2008 rumbled its way toward the Kazianet station. This train was massive, 70 cars long, hauled by a heavy locomotive and helmed by two experienced railroaders, brothers Vadim and Igor Supernenko. They'd passed through Kazianet countless times before, but
Ain't that the name of Tyler Creator's album?
this time was different. As the train approached the station, the brothers noticed something on the tracks ahead. Whatever it was difficult to make out in the sweep of the headlights initially, but Vadim sounded the horn, and at the same time he slammed on the emergency brakes. Unfortunately, a fully loaded freight train doesn't exactly stop on a dime, so despite the brothers' best efforts, they couldn't stop before they heard and felt the inevitable crunch beneath the steel wheels of the train. When it finally came to a stop, the brothers climbed down with their lanterns and started walking along the rails. They were used to wildlife near the tracks and even debris or the odd fallen branch, but this obstruction seemed completely out of the ordinary. And what they would eventually find would scar them for life. There, spread across the tracks, were the torn remnants of 7 people, although they might not have known quite how many people there were at the time. What was clear was that there was no movement or signs of life at all, and it didn't take much more than a momentary glance to determine that. The Supernenko brothers stood over the wreckage of what had once been a group of boys and realized they'd just become the unwilling participants of something horrific. Something
That's crazy. They done did some Red Dead Redemption type shit. Tied them niggas up to the railroad and wait for the train to come. That shit is wild, bro. I RP to them dudes, man. That's crazy. Trying to do your job, you a train conductor, and then you know you run over 7 niggas in the train. So I know that shit looked bad. Or probably like ripped up.
that couldn't possibly be explained by a simple accident. As soon as the dispatcher was alerted, the police from the nearby much larger Abakan station were sent to the scene. Floodlights arrived afterward, villagers were woken up to assist, and the grim task of retrieving the many parts began. Soon their names came in one by one, each one being realized to have come from the small community of Mesterchansk. Dmitry, Nikolai, Vadim, Oleg, Vyacheslav, Roman, and Victor, all of them just 15-year-old friends. They were a tight-knit group of boys who
These are kids, bro. These niggas ain't even do nothing.
played soccer together, attended school together, helped their parents, and they'd apparently gone on a simple weekend trip to collect cedar cones in the forest. Frustratingly though, according to investigators, this was nothing more than a tragic accident. The boys had ventured into the taiga on August 12th and by the following night intended to return home on the 10:39 p.m. train. Something, however, had obviously gone terribly wrong. Maybe they lost track of time, or maybe they got turned around in the woods. Whatever the reason, they apparently missed their train, and according to the initial report, they allegedly lay down to rest on the railway tracks. Even more strangely, their backpacks were found later lined up about 820 feet or 250 meters away. That detail would be the thing that made headlines: 7 bags placed in a row near the tracks as if part of some kind of ritual or pact.
I'm about to say, why would they lay? They didn't do that. Somebody killed them niggas. Why the fuck would niggas? There's not no cult suicide. You're not just gonna go. I'm pretty sure these niggas weren't trying to just go kill themselves together to go see a higher power, aliens in space or some shit. These niggas got murdered. There was some fucking weirdo in the fucking woods who hurt these fucking kids, and that nigga need to die. As simple as that.
And the implication was haunting, and reporters didn't hesitate to spin it as a possible agreement between the boys to end things. The idea was put forth that maybe it was deliberate. To the parents, however, this made no sense. These weren't reckless, troubled kids. They'd experienced in the wilderness, they weren't known to drink, and the toxicology report proved it, as no alcohol was found in any of their systems. They were all well fed, healthy, sharp, and cared for. The idea that they decided to end things or nap on top of the rails was beyond absurd. Like, for example, if that was somehow the case, how had no...
Exactly. How did none of them move? Somebody, they probably even killed them before they put them on the road. It's fucking sad, honestly. That shit kind of made me mad. It's kind of made me kind of sad. 5 kids, man.
None of them moved when the train approached. How did they not wake up? Even the Supernenko brothers testified that they weren't walking the tracks. They were lying on them, motionless, as if placed there. Still, officials pushed the narrative that this was just a tragic, horrific accident. The boys were said to have been exhausted and had made a...
I don't understand how you can even think this was an accident. No logical person. I'm like, officer, would you ever lay down on a railroad track? No, but why then? If you ain't doing it, what the fuck you think these kids gonna lay down on a railroad track for? I would love to know. Inform me, or I am uneducated.
A terrible mistake as a result, and the case was closed. But the parents obviously wouldn't let it go. Something more sinister was at play. They were sure.
Police did it.
Unfortunately, they had no proof, no support, and no leverage, but they did have grief, which was further sharpened by what they viewed as an indescribable injustice. In the meantime, the people of Mezdorchensk buried their sons in stunned silence, but this didn't last long. Soon, whispers became suspicions, and suspicions grew into fury. None of the families could accept the story they were being fed, and for 2 long years afterward, they pleaded with the local officials to reopen the case, only to have doors repeatedly slammed in their faces. Phone calls were also ignored, and paperwork was somehow lost. It was clear that authorities had no interest in revisiting the tragedy, especially when it meant admitting the original investigation not just been flawed, but possibly corrupt. In the face of this, the families went over their heads in the biggest way they possibly could. In the fall of 1991, they penned a desperate letter directly to Russian President Boris Yeltsin, appealing him to order the investigation to be re-examined. At the time, though, the Soviet Union was crumbling and the country was spiraling into chaos. The chances were slim that anyone would even read the letter, let alone act on it, but by some twist of fate, the letter found its way into the right hands, and against all odds, it worked. On October 8, 1991, the Prosecutor General's office officially reopened the investigation into the Kazinet deaths. 2 new names were then assigned to the case: Vladimir Guzenkov, an investigator for especially important cases, and criminal prosecutor Yuri Stolyarov. And thankfully, these weren't small-time paper pushers. They were serious men pulled from Moscow to handle difficult cases, and they got to work immediately. They arrived in Kazinet sometime afterward to find that the scene was long erased by time that had passed since the initial discovery. Rain, snow, and rot had stripped away nearly every trace of evidence. They also found that what little had existed back in 1989 had been mishandled by police or outright ignored. Vladimir then began by knocking on every door, interviewing every local, and pressing for details again and again. What he found, strangely enough, was a wall of silence. The villagers, nearly all of them related to one another, claimed to know nothing. They all said they'd been asleep at the time the train rolled over the Seven. As he continued to press, though, Vladimir kept hearing the name Vasily, who was a local man serving time for killing his own brother Slava. The murder seemed like just another drunken brawl, but in light of the new investigation, it now looked different. Especially when Vladimir learned that Slava may have let it slip while intoxicated about what really happened to the Seven at Kazinet. Upon learning this, he went to the prison, and over multiple visits, he chipped away at Vasily. At first, the story was muddled and it shifted, and then a confession emerged. It was partial and reluctant, but it was enough to really begin to push. Vasily then let slip that he and one of his other brothers, Yuri, had been involved, and just like that, everything the authorities had insisted wasn't true came crashing down. The deeper Vladimir dug, though, the clearer it became
The niggas can't. Never mind.
that Vasily's story just wasn't lining up. It still seemed he was being deceptive. Vladimir then requested that the families allow him to exhume the bodies. It was a dark undertaking, but when the caskets were opened and forensics experts took a second look, what they found changed the narrative forever. The 7, as had been suspected, had not been killed by the train. Instead, it was determined that they'd been attacked savagely and methodically. And the injuries were chilling in their consistency: fractures to skulls, jaws shattered on both sides, and trauma to the chest and abdomen. Each of the 7 bore the unmistakable signs of blunt objects. Experts also ran tests using biomannequins trying to replicate the wounds, and found a match only when they used the exact tools found in railway depots. It was clear this was no accident, and now there was physical evidence to actually prove it, or at least investigators willing to not look the other way. The Supernenko brothers would then back that up with their testimony. According to the 2 train drivers, when they realized what was on the tracks and saw them in the train's headlights moments before, they weren't scattered chaotically. They were lined up and arranged, placed on the rails exactly where the train would ensure an unrecognizable end. This also aligned with the state of the backpacks, the complete lack of alcohol or drugs in the victim's systems, and the absence of panic injuries. Vladimir's new working theory was that they were ambushed, attacked, and then laid across the tracks. With that, the case file was now a murder investigation, and one with more questions than answers, because while Vasily had started talking, what he said still didn't make sense. His claim that he and a brother had done this to all 7 seemed unlikely. The boys were athletic and healthy, the brothers, meanwhile, were thin and sickly. How could these 2 men overpower 7 healthy individuals without one of them getting away? This is when the story changed again. Vasily claimed that there had been a third attacker, Slava, the brother that he had later killed. Vasily claimed that Slava had been the one to land the fatal blows, which was convenient since Slava was already gone and couldn't contradict anything. Still, Vladimir pressed on. He had a hunch this wasn't just a family affair, and then he managed to get another slip from Vasily. During a separate interrogation, Vasily blurted out a new name, Nikolai. This wasn't the name of just some villager.
This nigga Vasily, like, this nigga a rat. Damn, this nigga getting on everybody, huh? Damn. They must have brought this nigga a fucking quarter pounder in McDonald's Sprite.
It was that of a senior police lieutenant from the nearby village who was in Kazinet that weekend visiting
Then they giving it
relatives.
all
He
up.
was also a man of authority and power. When
So it's me, Yuri, Nikolai. So we both saw them walking in, and that nigga just.
Vladimir caught up with Nikolai, Nikolai claimed that he had left the village well before the incident, and this seemed like an ironclad alibi until the
It was me and my 30 buckas and Nikolai. I don't have a good Russian accent.
locals contradicted him. Nikolai had been there at the time of the incident after all. Witnesses claimed to have seen him drinking with the brothers and a local foreman of the track crew. They were all together that night and they were consuming heavily, apparently liters of homebrew. Eventually, through more conversation, another name surfaced. A man named Pyotr, who was the foreman's brother, but Pyotr wouldn't be talking to Vladimir. It's not that he refused, it's that he was dead, having apparently ended things not long after the investigation reopened. At this point, things were coming together to form.
Nigga knew it was raps. he knew Valisi was gonna get everybody up. This nigga, he called it quits before it even started. Hey, that's a smart thing to do if you ain't trying to go to jail for life.
A disturbing
Eat
picture.
a fucking
Then, during one particularly grueling round
hot
of
dogs
questioning,
with bread
the local foreman broke. He'd
and
had
baked
enough of the constant
beans
questions and guilt, so he agreed to
that
tell
aren't
Vladimir
even sweet.
everything he wanted to know. He would then name names, he described the night, he spoke about the drinking, the confrontation, and the weapons. And then came the final revolting truth of what really happened to the Seven in 1989. 2 years prior, the sun dipped below the dense canopy of the taiga, and Kazinet settled into its familiar nighttime hush. In one of the few houses near the tracks, though, there was a lot of noise coming from men consuming hard. At least 3 liters of homebrew were being passed around, maybe more. And the names around the table were already familiar. There was the local foreman and his brother, there was also Vasily and his brother Yuri, and the visiting police lieutenant Nikolai. They weren't celebrating or mourning anything, they were just bored, and boredom in Kazinet can be a dangerous thing. As the drinks flowed and the evening wore on, they eventually ran out, but that didn't have to mean their night was over. They still wanted more, but the only thing that could be considered a store in town was long closed, so they did what Cazanet men sometimes did when desperate. They went to the train station in search of yashes, which is slang for train cargo handlers who sometimes carry stash for barter or bribes. That night, however, there were no yashes to be found. There were just 7 boys, all strangers to the men, standing near the rails waiting for a train. They would claim that the boys were trying to short-circuit the rails using a piece of wire to trip the signal and stop the next train so they could hop aboard, but that story never held water. There was no wire or proof, and the boys had come prepared to leave on the 10:39 p.m. electric train. They knew the schedule by heart and had no reason to interfere with the tracks, but the men latched onto the excuse anyway. They needed any sort of justification, no matter how thin. A confrontation then erupted, voices rose, and then the attack began. According to the confessions, everything started with a police lieutenant. He was strong, muscular, armed, and filled with a sense of authority, and he didn't hesitate. When one of the 7 supposedly melted...
See, bro, you know how it is with some of these police officers, bro. They be having, like, I don't know, they be thinking that they got, like, authority or something. Like, they become Cartman, like, for real. They be thinking that they own you and shit just because they got a badge. It's them type of niggas I don't fuck with. Like, I mean, you gotta treat me like a human, bro. Or else we ain't doing nothing. We ain't going nowhere. But it looks like that's what happened here. Niggas, he got out of hand. This shit probably won't happen now, but this was like damn near 30, 40 years ago. So shit like this, it was way easier. Imagine like even like before that, like how the Wild West and all that shit was. Even in other countries, imagine how it was before laws really were like really established, like, and actually, you know what I mean? Actually, like, taken seriously, I guess.
Off to him, maybe trying to stand up for his friends or trying to defuse the situation, Nikolai hit him in the head with the butt of his firearm. This was apparently instantly fatal, causing the others to freeze. And for a split second afterward, the boys didn't believe what had just happened.
He killed him in one hit.
Nikolai then charged the other men to finish them off and leave no witnesses.
I know getting pistol whipped, that shit must hurt. But you gonna die, like, dying after one? Damn, that's sad, man. I mean, they were kids. This shit
Any
crazy.
tools within reach were grabbed, and the men descended like animals. Some of the 7 tried to run, and one of them likely could have escaped, but Nikolai still had his firearm. He then commanded them to stop or he'd use it. Those who were yet to be attacked then froze again, and the men continued until they were all lying in the dirt beside the rails. Afterward, Nikolai, a supposed protector of law and order, directed the others again, this time to stage the scene. A train was due to pass soon, so they moved the 7 carefully and deliberately across the tracks. Then they lined up their backpacks a few hundred feet away to help sell the story that these were just tired and foolish boys who lay down to rest. Then when the grisly task was complete...
But who would believe that? What made you think somebody would believe that? I mean, they got away with it for some years, but hey, what made you think somebody would believe four 15-year-old kids would lay on the train track to wait for a train at 10:30 at night? 10:30 at night. They're not, dude. Hey, man.
The men scattered. Later, the 1:40 a.m. train would come through Cazanet, obliterating the remains. By the time the Supernenko brothers stepped off their freight train and walked the track with their lanterns in hand, the men were long gone and the boys were well beyond saving. And with that, the truth, as ugly and deplorable as it was, had finally been revealed. By the time the case reached court, the entire country was watching. And despite the court convening in 1995, nearly 6 years after the initial discovery, the courtroom was packed with parents of victims, reporters, locals, and just people who had followed the case. For more than 7 months afterward, the trial dragged on through proceedings. And then, finally, when the judge read and delivered the verdict, it was so lengthy that it took over an hour. Nikolai, who led the attack, was sentenced to capital punishment, as was the foreman and brothers Vasily and Yuri. Finally, it seemed justice had been served. This seemed like a rare moment of accountability in a system where things could often be volatile, but just as the men began to wait in their cells, the country took a political pivot. In a move aimed at joining the Council of Europe, Russia began aligning its laws with the European human rights standards, including the abolition of capital punishment. On May 31st, 1996, the first deputy chairman of the Supreme Court of Russia filed a protest. In it, he asked to overturn the verdict of the court and transfer the case for a new investigation. The Supreme Court then agreed, and just like...
Why would you do that? Why? Why? What's the point of this? Why just leave it alone? Let them niggas eat shit burgers.
that, everything unraveled. Not only were the sentences tossed out, but due to the convoluted legal mess and procedural timelines, the previously convicted men were released just like that. And they weren't retried or held in custody, they were just set free. And if you can believe it, things got even darker from there. After his release, Vasily attacked a cousin of his who, according to some, had known everything and wasn't planning to keep his mouth shut during the reopened investigation. Meanwhile, Yuri, who was one of the brothers who was convicted, was also found dead by either suffocation or sudden pneumonia, depending on which report you believe. Then came the most chilling incident of all. A railroad worker who was one of the key witnesses who had helped remove the seven from the tracks was also found under the wheels of a train at Kazinet, allegedly as the result of slipping and falling on the tracks. So as horrific as the initial incident was, somehow it hadn't just ended in 1989. It seemed to have just changed direction, but admirably through it all, the families who had been betrayed and beaten down by bureaucracy kept fighting. By the late 1990s, the story of the Kazinet 7 had faded from the headlines.
It's like, you just let these niggas out so they can kill more people. Now all these other niggas dying because they're scared. They don't want to go back, even though they should have did the shit they did in the first place.
Other scandals had taken their place, and there were more than enough of those. The country, by then, was cracking under the weight of corruption, war, and transition, and most people assumed the case was dead, but the parents of the victims were relentless. In February 1997, they managed to push hard enough for the Prosecutor General's office to reopen the case once more, this time under the legal banner of, quote, circumstances not fully investigated. It would take 4 more years, 3 additional exhumations, 5 expert forensic reviews, and more than 100 witnesses. There were testimonies not previously considered, forensics experts re-examining these same broken bones, and mountains of old paperwork that were hauled back out under the light of government offices. And through it all, one name that kept coming out during those years was that of Nikolai. Since his release, he had become a municipal deputy. You heard that right, one of the central figures in the murder of the 7 had parlayed his time out of prison into a political seat, but in the fall of 2001, something miraculous happened. The Supreme Court of the Republic of Khakassia issued a new verdict, and Nikolai, the foreman, and Vasily were once again found guilty of the murders. This time, the sentences were final, but to many, they still didn't come close enough to fitting the crime. Nikolai and the foreman were sentenced to just 10 years in a maximum security penal colony, while Vasily got just 7 years. For the parents, again, it wasn't justice.
Years?
And even then, Nikolai, true to form, never stopped filing appeals. The man who ordered the entire incident still claimed that he was the real victim, and the family simply endured it all. Despite the loss, lies, retrials, and political maneuvering, the truth finally came out and it stuck. Not because the system worked, but because the parents refused to let it stay buried. And in the end, they forced the world to look at what really happened on that cold August night in 1989. Kazinet was never and will never be the same as it was before the murder of the 7. The town, for all its supposed concern and regret over the case, always knew something, and its silence was complicity. What happened there is now more than just an unspeakable crime. It's a cautionary tale about the failure of justice and about what happens when the people in power believe they can get away with anything. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching.
Thank you. You made it far this month. If you made it this far, thanks so much for fucking watching. Damn, nigga. I should have subscribed to old dude. Scary, interesting. You know what I'm saying? And then subscribe to me while you at it. You might as well. You're already on a video game, especially if you made it this far. See, it's kind of weird if you don't. You know what I'm saying? But hey, that's up to you at the end of the day. Alright, though.